The Fixed Liberty podcast is presented by the Fixed Liberty Project, where we explore the fundamental principles of liberty and morality upon which a free society stands and thrives. Learn more and sign up for our free weekly email newsletter at fixedliberty.com.
Hello and welcome to the Fixed Liberty Podcast. Today is Monday, May 29th, 2023. I'm your host, Ross Brown. Thank you so much for joining me on this show today. It's Memorial Day today. I always think it's kind of a strange thing to say Happy Memorial Day. It's not really a happy day. On Memorial Day here in the United States, we pause to remember and give thanks to those who have sacrificed their lives so that we might live in a free nation. May we, the living, daily honor their memory in how we conduct ourselves as a free people. There's been a lot of attention paid to our national debt recently, because every few years our federal representatives focus their nonsensical bickering on the issue of the federal debt ceiling. Political gamesmanship ensues, with each side playing to its base. Republicans pretend to show political courage and fiscal restraint. Democrats pretend to show compassion for government dependence. In the end, the story is always the same. After a few weeks of fabricated drama, the federal debt ceiling is raised and America's march to insolvency stays its course. There is no reason to think that this year's version of the story will be any different. Today, our national debt sits at nearly $32 trillion. And to get your mind wrapped around that, we've got a United States population of about 330 million people. That means that every man, woman, and child of the United States owes, in effect, in round numbers, approximately $100,000 in public debt. And yet we have this question in our society today. Does our national debt even matter? The fact that we the people even debate such a question reveals the absurdity in our thinking. Now, mind you, we have not been set up for success. Experts and academics tend to complicate simple subjects to stroke their own egos. But the truth is that few subjects are simpler than the question of national debt. And to reveal this simple truth, let's just walk through an easy thought experiment. Question for you: does one person's debt matter? If you've ever been in debt, you understand its weight, its burdens, and its potentially disastrous consequences. An individual cannot ignore their debts as if they don't exist, nor can they borrow more in perpetuity. When an individual's debts come due, the individual must either repay their debts or declare bankruptcy. So yes, surely one person's debt matters. But what about two people? Let's suppose two individually indebted people get married, and maybe they take on some collective debt too, say a home mortgage. Do their debts still matter? Yes, obviously. So what about 10 people? What if 10 individually indebted people decided somehow to legally pool their finances? Would their collective debt still matter? Well, of course. If the pool didn't pay its debts, its creditors would sue it for payment. And the pool, at that point, would either pony up the cash or go bust. So what about 100 people? Does a bigger pool somehow negate the underlying nature of collective debt? If yes, how many individuals need to band together before their collective debt no longer matters? Is it 1,000? 10,000? 330 million, perhaps? The simple truth is that the underlying nature of collective debt does not change regardless of how many individuals join the pool. Eventually, bills come due, and the pool either repays its debts or it becomes insolvent. But wait, does this simple truth change if we, the people, institute our pool with the powers of government? Does our pool magically sidestep the underlying nature of collective debt if we simply call it government? Surely it does not. Government is not a magical entity. Despite what politicians might have us believe, government is an institution comprised wholly of humans, not all-powerful wizards or gods. Simple reason thus rightfully concludes that government debt matters. When a government's bills come due, a government either repays its debts or is bankrupted. There is, however, one critical difference between private individuals and private pools and some institutions of government on the subject of debt. Certain governments are empowered to create money, and those governments can declare bankruptcy in two distinct ways. They can either make their declaration in the traditional sense, or they can make their declaration by creating new worthless money to repay the face value of the government's debts. The end result, bankruptcy, is the same. Only the means of declaration differs. Adam Smith, author and father of modern economics, analyzes these two types of bankruptcy declaration in his concluding chapter of The Wealth of Nations, a chapter he entitled Of Public Debts, by stating, quote, "When national debts have once been accumulated to a certain degree, there is scarce, I believe, a single instance of their having been fairly and completely paid. The liberation of the public revenue, if it has ever been brought about at all, has always been brought about by a bankruptcy, sometimes by an avowed one, which is to say a traditional declaration, but always by a real one, though frequently by a pretended payment, which is to say paying creditors back with new and worthless money." Unquote. Money is valuable only when it is backed by productivity, which is the creation of valuable goods and services in an economy. New money created by government without the backing of new productivity is therefore worthless. When governments pay off creditors with new worthless money, inflation naturally results. Smith goes on to describe the subsequent injustice, saying, quote, "A pretended payment of this kind, therefore, instead of alleviating, aggravates in most cases the loss of the creditors of the public, and without any advantage to the public, extends the calamity to a great number of other innocent people due to the resulting inflation. It occasions a general and most pernicious subversion of the fortunes of private people, enriching in most cases the idle and profuse debtor at the expense of the industrious and frugal creditor, and transporting a great part of the national capital from the hands which were likely to increase and improve it to those which are likely to dissipate and destroy it." Unquote. Smith concludes his analysis of public debts by identifying, quote, "when it becomes necessary for a state to declare itself bankrupt, in the same manner as when it becomes necessary for an individual to do so, a fair, open, and avowed bankruptcy is always the measure which is both least dishonorable to the debtor and least hurtful to the creditor. The honor of a state is surely very poorly provided for when, in order to cover the disgrace of a real bankruptcy, it has recourse to a juggling trick of this kind, so easily seen through, and at the same time so extremely pernicious." Unquote. Earlier this month, The Economist's cover story was blunt. Quote, "Governments are living in a fiscal fantasy land. The world over, they are failing to confront the dire state of their finances." Unquote. The story went on to report, quote, "Politicians need to get real fast. Public debts are in danger of becoming unmanageable, especially if interest rates stay high. Every step up in borrowing hampers government's ability to respond to the next crisis. And there are limits to how far spending can be controlled. Politicians could dial down their promises to pensioners or ensure that their role in the green transition is not larger than it needs to be. But there is little public appetite for austerity, and spending is bound to rise as populations age. More defense spending and green investment are essential." Unquote. The Economist concludes that, quote, "all this makes tax rises inevitable." Unquote. And such a prospect turns my stomach. Like Smith, I recognize that taxes often remove valuable resources from people who would put them to productive use to pay for government programs which go on to dissipate and destroy them. For this, among many reasons, I highly favor low taxes and small government. But also like Smith and The Economist and America's founding fathers and a litany of other classically liberal thinkers who have come before me, I support financial responsibility in government to an even greater degree. If a generation is going to run any aspect of its life through the institution of government, that same generation better damn well pay for it with their own tax dollars. Debt financing the costs of today's public programs burdens tomorrow's taxpayers, many of whom have not even been born yet. It is taxation without representation. It is the epitome of selfishness, greed, and short-sightedness. It is moral wickedness. And it will almost assuredly continue in the days ahead when the federal government again raises its debt ceiling without a plan to fix the underlying budget problems which cause the debt in the first place. God help us. Our government cannot afford to do so. Thanks for tuning in to this episode of the Fixed Liberty Podcast. I'll see you next time.